My name is Erik Müller, and I was 22 when the war reached into my life in ways I could never have imagined. I grew up in the bustling port city of Hamburg, the son of a shipwright and a schoolteacher. My earliest memories are filled with the scent of salt water, the clang of hammers on steel, and the endless rhythm of the Elbe River. I would sit for hours on the docks, staring at the U-boats and cargo ships, dreaming of the day I could touch the wheel of a vessel and feel the ocean beneath me. From a young age, I was curious and restless, eager to learn everything about the ships that shaped my city. I was also stubborn, often arguing with my father over the proper way to handle a hull or tighten a bolt. But above all, I was loyal to my family, to my friends, and unknowingly to the call of the sea that would soon lead me into a war I neither chose nor fully understood. When the Reich called its youth to serve, I felt a complicated mixture of duty and fear. The thought of leaving my parents, my small circle of friends, and the familiar streets of Hamburg was suffocating. Yet there was a part of me that could not resist the pull of adventure, the chance to test my courage and skill in the vast, unknown Atlantic. I clung to the pride that, perhaps in some small way, I could make a difference even as a tiny cog in the monstrous machinery of war. Looking back, I realize now that it was not just the war that awaited me. It was the isolation of the U-boat, the endless tension under the cold gray waves, and the unrelenting question, would I survive? My childhood dreams of the sea had led me here, but the reality would challenge every ounce of my resolve, forcing me to confront fear, loss, and the true cost of duty. The year was 1941, and the Atlantic had become a deadly chessboard. Germany's U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting the convoys that tried to sustain Britain and the Soviet Union. Hamburg, my home, was more than just a city. It was a beating heart of shipbuilding and maritime trade. The docks where I had spent my childhood were now bustling with sailors, engineers, and young recruits like me, all preparing for missions that could last weeks, sometimes months, with no guarantee of return. The air in the city was thick with tension and uncertainty. The war was no longer a distant rumble. It was here at the edges of our streets in the night air, filled with the echo of air raid sirens. Buildings trembled under the distant roar of Allied bombs. Neighbors whispered about lost friends and family members drafted into the Navy or the Army. Life continued, but it was shadowed by fear, rationing, and the constant awareness that one misstep or one unlucky strike from the enemy could be the last moment of a person's life. As I walked the streets, I could feel the weight of history pressing down. The city had endured before, yet now it faced a new kind of siege. Every ship that departed from Hamburg's harbor carried more than cargo. It carried the hopes, fears, and lives of those aboard. I remember seeing young sailors, boys barely older than me, marching toward the docks, their eyes wide with a mix of pride and terror. It was in that atmosphere that I learned the true meaning of courage, not as an abstract idea, but as a survival mechanism in a world where death and duty were inseparable. Even in the midst of fear, there was a strange rhythm to life. The harbor remained alive with the sounds of machinery, the smell of tar and salt, and the chatter of men preparing for missions. It was a city on edge, yet resilient, holding on to normalcy in the brief hours before another wave of danger swept through. For me, this was the world I had grown into, familiar yet unforgiving, beautiful yet lethal, and it would be the stage upon which the first chapter of my journey into the depths of the Atlantic and into the heart of war would unfold. As I stood on the dock watching the U-boat bob gently in the harbor, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. I had dreamed of the sea all my life, yet now the reality of what lay ahead pressed down on me, like the weight of the ocean itself. The vessel was compact, cold, and foreboding, its steel hull hiding a labyrinth of corridors where sound and air were both precious commodities. Every hatch, every gauge, every narrow passage whispered a warning danger could come from the waves above or the depths below at any moment. The men who would be my companions in this claustrophobic world had faces that mirrored my own mixture of anticipation and fear. Some tried to joke to mask the trembling in their hands, while others stared silently at the water, lost in thoughts I could only guess at. I wondered if we would all survive the first patrol or the second or the third. Death was an invisible passenger sitting beside us in every cabin, every engine room, every watch on deck. Even as the sun dipped low, casting an orange glow across the harbor, I felt the pull of the unknown. Letters from my parents and little notes from childhood friends had been tucked into my pocket, reminders of a life I might not return to. I felt a surge of determination to endure, to keep my promise to my family and my crew. Yet deep down, I knew that courage alone would not be enough. I sensed with a clarity that chilled me that this journey would test more than my skill as a sailor. It would challenge my resolve, my morality, and my very sense of self. The sea, once a playground of dreams, would become a crucible. And in the days ahead, I would confront fear loss and decisions that could haunt me for the rest of my life. It was the beginning of a voyage from innocence to experience, from boyhood dreams to the harsh reality of war, and I could feel that nothing would ever be the same again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the harbor in hues of orange and crimson, I felt a storm of emotions swirling inside me. The U-boat lay anchored quietly, its steel hull gleaming in the dying light, yet it radiated an ominous promise of the dangers to come. The distant wail of a foghorn echoed across the water, mingling with the faint cries of gulls, and I realized this was the final moment of calm before being swallowed by the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. I clutched a small envelope in my pocket, a letter I had hastily scribbled to my mother that morning. Mother, I am about to set sail. I do not know when I will return. The words felt heavy as if the paper itself carried the weight of uncertainty, fear, and love. Beside me, my companion placed a firm hand on my shoulder, his eyes locking with mine. We must survive for each other, Erik, he said. In that fleeting twilight, I felt both exhilaration and dread, the thrill of adventure entwined with the sharp sting of anxiety. The harbor, the city, the life I knew, all would soon be left behind. I took a deep breath, knowing that the journey ahead would test every ounce of courage I possessed, that every decision, every movement could mean life or death. And with that, the adventure, terrifying, profound, and unforgettable, was about to begin. The day I received my orders, I felt an odd mixture of pride and dread. At 22, I was about to leave the familiar streets of Hamburg for a world that I had only glimpsed in my childhood dreams of the sea. The enlistment office was crowded with young men, some trembling, some trying to mask their fear with bravado. I stood in line, clutching my papers, and tried to imagine myself as a competent sailor, even though deep down I had no idea what awaited me beneath the waves. Training began almost immediately. The first days were a whirlwind of rules, schedules, and endless drills. I learned to navigate the complex control panels of a U-boat, understanding how diesel engines powered us on the surface while batteries drove us silently through the deep. Every lever, every gauge, every blinking light demanded attention. A single misstep could lead to catastrophe not only for me, but for everyone aboard. I spent hours learning the mechanics of the periscope, how to identify distant ships, and how to track their speed and course. Weapons training was a different kind of trial. I had never held a torpedo before, and yet here I was, being taught to load it, aim it, and release it with deadly precision. The instructors drilled us relentlessly, emphasizing that hesitation could mean death. My hands shook during my first practice run, but each small success bolstered my confidence. There was an intoxicating thrill in learning that skill, even as I understood the grim reality. These torpedoes were instruments of destruction, and each one would carry consequences I might never fully comprehend. Life inside the submarine was its own test. The corridors were narrow, the air heavy with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of machinery. We slept in tight bunks, ate quickly, and always remained aware of the lurking dangers. Emergency drills reminded us that fire flooding or mechanical failure could strike at any moment. Every alarm sent hearts racing, every mistake was a lesson learned under pressure. Despite the intensity, camaraderie grew quickly. My fellow recruits became my lifeline, our conversations brief but earnest. One night, as we cleaned and polished the torpedo tubes, a senior sailor leaned over and said, "Erik, remember this, in this vessel we are one. One mistake, one panic, and we all pay the price. But trust in your hands, trust in your eyes, and trust in your mates. You will survive." In quiet moments, I thought of my parents, their faces etched in memory, and the city I was leaving behind. Hamburg felt impossibly far away, and yet their voices, their lessons lingered with me. The sea I had loved as a boy now felt like a stage for fear, skill, and endurance. With each passing day of training, I realized that survival would demand more than knowledge. It would demand courage, composure, and a willingness to accept the weight of responsibility. By the time we were ready to board our first patrol, I was no longer just a boy from Hamburg. I was a crew member of a U-boat, and the Atlantic awaited. The morning we were to depart, Hamburg seemed suspended in a fragile calm, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I hugged my mother tightly, feeling the tremor in her hands and the silent tears pressing against her cheeks. My father, ever stoic, placed a firm hand on my shoulder and said nothing but his eyes betrayed worry and pride in equal measure. I wanted to reassure them to convince myself that I was ready, but the lump in my throat made words impossible. Before boarding, I scribbled a letter in haste, folding it carefully and tucking it into the breast pocket of my uniform. Mother, Father, I am about to set sail. I do not know when I will return or if I will return at all. Please keep hope alive for me as I will carry your love with me across the Atlantic. The act of writing, of putting my fears and promises on paper, brought a fleeting sense of control in a situation where so much felt uncertain. The harbor was alive with activity crewmen shouting orders, the rhythmic clang of machinery, and the low hum of the diesel engines in the submarine below. I walked along the dock one last time, taking in the familiar sights, the creaking of the cranes, the smell of tar and salt, the cries of gulls circling above. Each detail etched itself into my memory, a mosaic of home that I could carry with me into the unknown. My fellow sailors gathered beside me, their own faces a mixture of apprehension and determination. One leaned close and said, "We will survive this, Erik. For our families, for each other." I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to absorb courage from their conviction. As we descended the gangway and entered the steel hull of the U-boat, the world above seemed to shrink, leaving only the cold metallic corridors that would become both our sanctuary and our prison. I took a final glance at the harbor, the city, the life I knew, and whispered to myself, I will return or I will endure. With that, the journey began. The first pulse of a long, harrowing voyage that would test every ounce of my courage and resolve. The first days at sea were a mixture of awe and terror. As the submarine slid beneath the waves, the world above disappeared, replaced by the cold, dimly lit corridors that would be our home for weeks. The hum of the diesel engines on the surface and the subtle vibrations of the electric motors below were constant reminders that the sea could be both friend and executioner. I moved carefully, learning the rhythm of the vessel, memorizing every lever, every hatch, every gauge. One wrong move could flood the compartments, disable the engines, or alert an enemy ship. Our mission was simple in description, but perilous in execution. Locate Allied convoys, shadow them, and strike with precision. The first sighting of an enemy convoy sent a jolt through me. Silhouettes of merchant ships guarded by destroyers appeared on the horizon, their decks teeming with men I would soon be trained to view as targets. My hands shook as I manipulated the periscope, tracking their speed and course, calculating the angles that would determine life or death. When the order came to fire, our first torpedo time seemed to slow. My heart pounded in my ears. I could hear the metallic click of the loading mechanism, the soft murmur of the crew checking and rechecking settings. Steady, Erik, I told myself. Steady. One chance. One shot. My mind oscillated between exhilaration and dread. Hitting the target would mean success, but missing or worse, being detected could spell disaster. Now the captain's voice cut through the tense silence. I pressed the release, feeling a shudder ripple through the submarine as the torpedo slid into the water. The seconds that followed were an eternity. We watched as it streaked toward the convoy, tracking its path with breathless anticipation. The explosion was distant but unmistakable, followed by alarms and shouting from the enemy vessels. A sense of triumph mixed with horror washed over me. I had taken part in ending lives, fulfilling my duty, yet the weight of what we had done settled heavily on my chest. The following hours were no less intense. We maneuvered to evade detection, diving deep to escape the sonar pings of the destroyers, listening to the creaking of the hull under pressure and the haunting groans of the water outside. Every moment demanded vigilance. Every decision could mean survival or death. Yet, in that tension, camaraderie thrived. My fellow sailors moved with quiet precision, exchanging brief words of reassurance and observation. "Keep calm," one whispered. "Watch your instruments, trust your training." At night, I retreated to a small corner of the submarine to write a short letter to my parents, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. "Mother, Father, today I have seen both the power and the terror of this ocean. We are safe for now, but the waves carry danger at every turn. Pray for us as I pray for your guidance and courage." Writing helped me breathe, helped me feel a fragment of control amid the chaos. By the end of our first patrol, I understood the brutal rhythm of life aboard a U-boat hunt, strike, evade, survive. The Atlantic was indifferent, vast, and merciless. And I, Erik Müller, was no longer merely a boy from Hamburg. I was a crew member in a deadly game, learning that courage and fear could coexist, each sustaining the other in a delicate balance that determined life and death. As we patrolled the vast expanse of the Atlantic, the reality of the broader war pressed upon me like the weight of the deep sea. It was the summer of 1941, and the Battle of the Atlantic had entered one of its deadliest phases. Convoys of merchant ships carried the lifeblood of Britain and the Soviet Union, their decks bristling with men and cargo essential to the war effort. Allied forces had learned from earlier losses. Destroyers were equipped with sonar aircraft, patrolled relentlessly, and depth charges could turn the ocean into a deadly trap in minutes. Every sighting, every ping on the sonar reminded me that we were not only hunters, but also prey in a world of unseen dangers. Reports filtered through the radio about U-boats that never returned, crews lost to the cold, unforgiving sea. I read them quietly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Each story was a cautionary tale, a shadow looming over our own missions. The success of our attacks came with a cost for every ship we sank. The enemy intensified its countermeasures. Survival depended not just on skill, but on constant vigilance and the ability to suppress fear long enough to act decisively. Within the cramped corridors of our vessel, tension was palpable. The crew moved like a single organism, each member acutely aware that a mistake by one could doom all. I felt it in my own chest, the tightness, the racing pulse, the struggle to maintain focus despite the gnawing fear. Nights were worse when the creaks and groans of the submarine amplified every imagined threat. The ocean outside was a living thing, indifferent and merciless, and our tiny steel craft was both fortress and coffin. Even so, moments of small victories punctuated the anxiety. Successfully maneuvering past an escorting destroyer or watching a torpedo strike its target brought bursts of adrenaline relief and pride. Yet these fleeting highs were tempered by the knowledge that the next encounter could end everything. Every decision, dive, surface, fire, weight was weighted with consequence. Through it all, I clung to routine training and camaraderie. The brief words of reassurance from a fellow sailor, the silent nod of the captain, even the steady hum of the engines became anchors amid the storm of stress. I realized that surviving the Battle of the Atlantic required more than technical skill. It required mental resilience, trust in one's comrades, and a steady hand guided by both fear and courage. By the end of those first weeks, I understood that the war was as much about endurance and nerve as it was about strategy and firepower, and that each patrol would push me closer to the limits of human endurance. During brief lulls in the patrol, I would retreat to a quiet corner of the submarine to gather my thoughts and write short letters to my parents. Mother, Father, the sea is immense and unforgiving. Each day tests our resolve, and yet I am learning what it means to rely on my skills and my comrades. Pray for our safety as I pray for the courage to endure. Writing these lines brought a fleeting sense of control, a bridge between the life I had left behind and the perilous reality surrounding me. Conversations with my fellow sailors became vital lifelines. One evening, while checking the torpedo tubes, a crewmate leaned close and whispered, "Erik, we are all in this together. Keep your head, trust the training, and trust us. That is how we survive." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down, but also the quiet reassurance of shared purpose. In those moments, fear and determination intertwined, each sustaining the other. Internally, I wrestled with a complex mix of emotions. There was exhilaration in mastering the vessel and witnessing the precision of our attacks, yet it was tinged with a profound awareness of the lives at stake. Every successful strike carried a shadow of consequence. Every close call left an imprint on my consciousness. The ocean, vast and indifferent, reminded me that survival required constant vigilance and composure. By the end of our first missions, I began to understand the rhythm of life aboard a U-boat: alertness, action, reflection, and trust. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that the bonds forged in this claustrophobic, high-stakes environment would define not only our survival, but also the man I was becoming. The Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead, and I knew that the challenges, losses, and triumphs yet to come would test the very limits of endurance and character. The alarm sounded before I even realized what was happening. A sharp, insistent ping on the sonar sent a shiver down my spine. The captain's voice cut through the tense hum of the control room. Contact depth, charge incoming, brace for evasive maneuvers. My hands flew over the controls, heart hammering, sweat prickling my temples. Every lever, every gauge suddenly felt like the difference between life and death. Outside the Atlantic was a churning gray expanse, waves pounding against the hull rain, slicing the air like shards of glass. Through the periscope, I caught fleeting glimpses of destroyers, sleek, purposeful, deadly, closing in on our position. I could feel the vibrations of their engines through the still beneath my feet, the subtle pulse of sonar echoing through the hull like a predator stalking its prey. We dove. The submarine lurched violently, water pressure pressing on the outer hull, groaning and creaking under the strain. My lungs seemed to tighten with the depth, each breath shallow and labored. I adjusted the ballast, checked the gauges, communicated orders in clipped urgent tones. Dive to 60 meters, reduce speed, silent running. The words were automatic, drilled into us through endless training, but my mind raced anyway, calculating probabilities, imagining worst-case scenarios. Every sonar ping from the destroyers felt like a hammer striking our fragile home. Each time I heard the distant thud of a depth charge, my stomach dropped, imagining the shock waves crushing the hull, ripping us apart. The lights flickered as power shifted between compartments. The familiar hum of the engines became a tense, almost musical rhythm marking our survival or our destruction. I glanced at my crewmates, faces pale, eyes wide, hands steady on valves and periscopes. Some whispered prayers. Others muttered instructions under their breath. The unity of the crew was palpable. Each of us was tethered to the other's fate. A single mistake, a misjudged maneuver, a delayed valve, a forgotten switch could doom us all. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on my chest, heavier than the steel above me. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in this tense ballet of cat and mouse. The destroyers circled, dropping charges in a deadly pattern, their sonar sweeps relentless. I held my breath, counting the intervals, feeling the shock waves ripple through the hull, hearing the faint cries of injured sailors from adjacent compartments. Fear clawed at me, but training and necessity overrode panic. I adjusted our depth-altered course subtly and watched as one charge detonated just meters from the bow, the concussive force rattling every bone in my body. In that moment, I realized the stark truth. The ocean was indifferent. Our vessel, fragile and survival, demanded every ounce of skill, courage, and instinct we could summon. My pulse raced, yet I forced myself to breathe steadily, to focus on the mechanics, to trust the crew. The Atlantic was a hunter, and we were a small, desperate quarry. But we had one advantage: disciplined preparation and the will to survive. When the immediate danger passed, I sank to a bulkhead, hands trembling, chest heaving. The adrenaline still coursed through me, but a grim clarity settled over my thoughts. We had survived this engagement, but at a cost I had yet to fully comprehend. The sea was vast, the enemy unyielding, and the war had only begun. The aftermath of the attack was a haunting silence that pressed on the steel walls of the submarine. The creaking and groaning of the hull still echoed, but the frantic alarms had ceased for now. As I moved through the narrow corridors, the reality of our losses hit me. Two of the youngest sailors, barely older than boys, lay motionless, victims of a near miss that had sent debris flying through the torpedo room. Their faces, pale and frozen, imprinted themselves in my mind in stark, unforgiving detail. I had been struck by shrapnel near my shoulder, a shallow wound, but I barely noticed it. The adrenaline still coursed through my veins, numbing the pain. What I felt instead was a deep, gnawing helplessness. My hands trembled as I assisted another crewmate in securing equipment, glancing repeatedly at those who would never return to their bunks or see the sun over Hamburg again. Each step along the corridors was a struggle between motion and memory, between attending to the living and acknowledging the dead. The submarine had become a chamber of ghosts. The air, thick and acrid, carried the faint metallic tang of blood and fear. I could hear muffled sobs from the far end of the vessel's sailors, trying to process what had just occurred while maintaining the disciplined routines that kept us alive. I felt a surge of guilt that I had survived while others had, not a heavy, unrelenting weight pressing on my chest. Why am I still breathing? I asked myself repeatedly. What am I meant to do with this life? PTSD, though I did not know the term then, had begun to take root. Nightmares had already begun to invade my sleep, flashes of the exploding depth, charges, the terrified faces of my comrades, the relentless pounding of the waves. Even in waking moments, the echoes of screams and metal tearing through flesh haunted my senses. I found myself flinching at every vibration, every unexpected creak of the hull. Amid the horror, the crew carried on. There was no time to grieve properly. The mission demanded focus, vigilance, and courage. We patched the wounded, secured loose equipment, and resumed silent running. Yet, each man wore the invisible scars of loss. Whispered names, hurried prayers, and silent nods conveyed our grief as much as words ever could. In the quiet moments, I allowed myself to remember their faces, their laughter, and the brief conversations we had shared. I vowed to honor them by surviving, by performing my duty with precision and courage. The sea had claimed them, the war had claimed them, but their presence remained with me, an unyielding reminder of the stakes and the fragility of life aboard a U-boat. By the time we surfaced briefly for air and assessment, I had begun to understand the true cost of command, action, and survival. It was not merely the threat from enemy destroyers or the churning Atlantic, it was the loss of comrades, the heavy weight of witnessing death firsthand, and the burden of continuing when so many could not. I realized that every decision, every maneuver was a gamble with life itself, and that the courage to act was inseparable from the grief that followed. The Atlantic was vast, indifferent, and cruel, but it was not the only battlefield I faced. In the quiet moments between patrols, my thoughts turned inward toward questions I had never asked myself before. Every torpedo fired, every convoy intercepted carried the weight of human lives. And sometimes those lives were not the uniformed soldiers I had imagined, but innocents caught in the machinery of war. I found myself questioning the morality of our actions, wrestling with guilt that was heavier than any physical wound. The first time I realized the full consequences, a merchant vessel laden not with military cargo but with food and clothing for civilians came into view. The captain issued the order to fire. I obeyed, hands steady on the controls, calculating speed and angle as taught, but my stomach knotted with each passing second. When the torpedo struck and the ship listed a cloud of smoke rising into the gray sky, I felt a hollow ache. There was no triumph in the result, only the stark recognition that I had participated in taking lives that might have been spared. I confided in a fellow sailor later, his voice barely above a whisper, as we stood in the cramped control room. Do you ever wonder what we're really doing, Erik? Are we soldiers or executioners? I looked at him, seeing the same uncertainty mirrored in his eyes, and nodded. I try to focus on survival, I said, though even to my own ears it sounded like a poor excuse. But sometimes I wonder if the orders we follow are the right ones. The ethical struggle became an invisible companion pressing on me as persistently as the ocean's pressure on the hull. I began to see war not as a series of glorious maneuvers, but as a series of choices with consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. I questioned the strategy, the purpose, the justification of killing not only soldiers, but anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each successful attack left me conflicted, a mixture of relief skill and a gnawing doubt that perhaps in the grand ledger of war, no one truly wins. These moral battles were compounded by the relentless tension of life aboard the submarine. There was never truly a safe moment to reflect, yet reflection found me in fleeting seconds during the hum of the engines, in the dim glow of the instrument panels, in the brief hush before the next sonar ping. I clung to discipline, to duty, and to the camaraderie that kept us functioning. But I knew that deep within a seed of doubt had been planted a question that would haunt every decision, every target, every patrol that followed. By the time we completed that patrol, I understood that war was as much a test of conscience as it was of skill. Courage alone could not shield a man from the moral weight of his actions. And as I stared at the endless gray horizon through the periscope, I realized that surviving the Atlantic would demand not only mastery of the vessel and trust in my comrades, but also the strength to live with the choices I had made. Days blurred into nights, though. The distinction mattered little inside the steel confines of the U-boat. The artificial lights cast a constant flickering glow, and the hum of the engines never ceased. Sleep was shallow, fitful, and often interrupted by alarms, sonar pings, or the distant echo of explosions above the water. Every sound was amplified, every vibration exaggerated by the enclosed metal, reminding us that we were suspended between survival and oblivion. Air became a commodity. Even with the scrubbers and ventilation running, the cabin was thick with the tang of diesel and the metallic undertone of human sweat. Breathing deeply offered little relief, and the air felt as though it were pressing down on our chests, each inhalation a reminder of our isolation beneath the unyielding ocean. I could sense the subtle tension among the crew. Every twitch, every hurried movement seemed magnified, as if even a misplaced glance could ignite panic. I found myself clinging to routine. Checks on the ballast, monitoring the sonar, adjusting the periscope, and logging every minor observation became rituals, a way to anchor myself amid the endless stress. Moments of idle conversation were rare, and carefully measured, any lapse in attention could have fatal consequences. Yet even in these brief exchanges, I glimpsed the resilience that bound us together. A nod, a whispered instruction, a hand on the shoulder, all were small acts of solidarity that preserved our sanity. The mental strain was relentless. Fear was a constant companion, and exhaustion dulled the edges of judgment. I noticed myself flinching at every unexpected noise, the clink of a hatch, the vibration of a valve, the creak of the hull. My thoughts drifted repeatedly to Hamburg, to my parents, and to the friends who had stayed behind. I questioned whether any of us would return to the world above, whether the sacrifices, the losses, and the moral compromises were worth it. Even as we adapted, the submarine imposed a psychological weight unlike any I had known. Days without sunlight, weeks without fresh air, and the endless monotony punctuated by moments of acute danger eroded our sense of time and space. I realized that endurance was as much about mental fortitude as it was about skill. To survive, I had to compartmentalize fear, manage stress, and trust in the meticulous preparation that had carried us this far. By the end of that relentless stretch, I felt both fragile and strangely empowered. Fragile because the pressure of constant vigilance left me raw and jittery. Empowered because I had learned to act decisively despite fear, to function in a machine that could kill or save us at any moment. Life aboard the U-boat was a crucible, and though I would carry scars of stress and trauma, I knew that every hour spent beneath the Atlantic's gray surface forged resilience, sharpened awareness, and bound me irrevocably to the fate of my comrades. The Atlantic revealed its fury in ways no enemy vessel could. One night, a storm swept over us, sudden and merciless. Waves rose like dark mountains, crashing against the submarine's steel hull with a relentless rhythm. Rain lashed horizontally, blinding us, and the wind tore across the deck, shrieking through the hatches like some spectral chorus. The vessel pitched violently, throwing unprepared sailors against bulkheads and railings while the engines groaned under the strain of the tumultuous sea. Inside, the corridors were a maze of chaos. Water seeped in through seams, dripping steadily onto the grated floors. The constant vibration of the engines, mixed with the thunder of the waves, created a symphony of pressure, tension, and fear. Every creak, every metallic resonance reminded us that the ocean was not merely a setting, but an active, indifferent predator. The U-boat was our sanctuary, and our coffin balanced precariously between survival and destruction. Through the periscope, I glimpsed the fury outside, waves breaking over each other in endless succession, darkness pressing in from every direction. The horizon was swallowed by gray, turbulent clouds, a void that seemed to stretch into infinity. There was no land, no safe harbor, only the vast, indifferent Atlantic. The sheer scale of the storm dwarfed our small craft, emphasizing our fragility and the ocean's omnipotence. The crew moved with tense precision, securing hatches, checking ballast, and adjusting course. There was no room for hesitation. A single misjudgment could capsize us or expose us to the storm's full wrath. I could feel my pulse in my throat lungs, burning from exertion and stress, every muscle taut with vigilance. Yet, amid the terror, there was a strange rhythm, a pattern to the chaos that reminded me why we trusted our training and one another. Isolation compounded the danger. The storm erased the familiar. There was no skyline, no moon, no stars to orient us. Only the crashing of water, the howl of wind, and the endless rolling darkness. Time lost, meaning seconds stretching into hours, punctuated by moments of acute fear whenever a wave struck or the hull shuddered. I thought of home, of Hamburg, distant and seemingly unreachable. The city, my family, even the simple comfort of sunlight, all felt impossibly far away. And yet I was tethered to the present by necessity. To survive, I had to act, to respond, to endure. Each wave, each gust of wind, each tremor of the vessel was a lesson in humility, resilience, and the raw, indifferent power of the natural world. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a battered but intact submarine and a crew exhausted but alive. The ocean had tested us, stripped away illusions of control, and revealed the stark reality of life beneath the waves. I realized that surviving the Atlantic required more than skill or courage. It demanded respect for the sea trust in my comrades and a readiness to face fear in its purest, most elemental form. Inside the submarine, every sound became magnified, a symphony of tension and impending danger. The hum of the engines was constant, a low vibration that reverberated through the hull and into my bones. Above it all, the sonar ping, sharp, precise, and relentless, served as both guide and tormentor. Each ping signaled the presence of destroyers or aircraft, reminding us that death could arrive in a heartbeat. Lights flickered across the cramped corridors, casting long shadows and illuminating the faces of my crewmates etched with exhaustion, fear, and determination. The dim glow made every movement feel dramatic, urgent, as if the smallest gesture could determine life or death. Water dripped from the ceilings and walls, the metal floor groaning beneath our boots as the submarine shifted with the swell of the ocean outside. When alarms sounded, chaos erupted. Orders were shouted over the din voices, overlapping urgent and clipped. Ballast adjust depth, periscope up. The rapid cadence of commands mixed with the thrum of machinery, the hiss of air, and the groan of metal under pressure. My heart raced and my hands moved on instinct, recalling every drill we had endured. I could hear the sharp intake of breath, the scraping of boots, the clanging of valves being turned, all blending into a cacophony of survival. The occasional explosion from a distant depth charge reverberated through the hull, a violent reminder that the enemy was near. The shock waves made me flinch, my stomach knotting with adrenaline. I could sense the fear in the air, thick and tangible, yet beneath it ran a thread of cohesion, the silent understanding that each of us had a role, and that failure could mean the death of all. Even the smallest sounds became exaggerated, the scrape of a hand against a bulkhead, the faint whisper of a sailor adjusting a gauge, the subtle vibration of torpedo tubes being prepared. Time itself felt distorted, seconds stretching and folding as tension mounted. In that confined, dimly lit space, the boundary between calm and panic was razor thin. One wrong move, one delayed order could turn the submarine into a tomb. Amid the chaos, I found a rhythm in the noise, a way to move with purpose despite the fear. The combination of light, sound, and motion became a language we all understood, each crew member reading and reacting to cues instinctively. The submarine was alive, and so were we, bound together by sound, by urgency, and by the stark reality that survival depended on attentiveness, courage, and unbreakable trust. By the end of the engagement, as the echoes faded into tense silence, I realized that the true battle was not only against the enemy, but against the relentless pressure of fear, noise, and confinement. Mastering that inner battlefield was as critical as any maneuver on the ocean's surface. The immediate threat had passed, but the silence that followed was no comfort. The submarine floated in the gray Atlantic, battered and trembling, its hull scarred by the pounding waves and near-miss depth charges. Around me, the crew moved quietly, tending to the wounded, checking instruments, and exchanging brief, measured words. There was relief in survival, but it was overshadowed by the weight of what we had lost. Faces of fallen comrades lingered in my mind, vivid and unyielding, reminding me that life aboard a U-boat was a fragile gift, never guaranteed beyond the next patrol. I sank against a bulkhead, my shoulder throbbing from the earlier shrapnel wound, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. The adrenaline still pulsed through my veins, but my thoughts turned inward. Fear, grief, and doubt churned together a storm as relentless as the one we had endured at sea. I questioned not only the purpose of our missions, but the morality of the war itself, haunted by the faces of innocence and the ethical compromises that survival demanded. Yet even in that haze of exhaustion and sorrow, a clarity emerged. I understood that survival required more than skill and courage. It demanded reflection, resilience, and the capacity to endure the unseen and unspoken horrors of conflict. The Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead, vast, indifferent, and unforgiving. And I knew with an uneasy certainty that the challenges, losses, and moral dilemmas we had faced so far were only the beginning. What lay beyond this patrol would test us in ways unimaginable, shaping not just our bodies but our souls. The journey was far from over, and the lessons of fear, loss, and endurance would follow me into the next chapter, a chapter that would define who I was and who I would become. The days after the last engagement were the hardest. The Atlantic calm on the surface could not soothe the storm inside me. I walked through the submarine corridors, seeing the faces of my fallen comrades in every shadow, hearing their voices in the echoes of the engines. Sleep was nearly impossible. I would lie in my narrow bunk, staring at the dim lights above my mind, replaying the screams, the explosions, the faces of those who had not survived. Each memory came unbidden, striking like the relentless waves outside. I had a shallow wound from a near-miss shrapnel strike, but it was insignificant compared to the invisible injuries etched into my mind. Survivor's guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder that I had lived while others had not. I questioned everything. Why had I been spared, and what right did I have to continue when so many of my friends so young were gone forever? I found myself replaying each decision, wondering if a slight hesitation, a different choice could have. Save them. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on my chest, yet I had to keep moving, keep functioning, or risk dragging the rest of the crew down with me. The wounded were tended with the efficiency that discipline demanded, but the air was thick with unspoken grief. Quiet conversations, muted sobs, and furtive glances conveyed our shared sorrow. I sought solace in letters, scribbling hurried words to my parents. Mother, father, the sea has shown me its cruelty. I have seen friends lost, and though we survive, the cost is heavy. Pray for us as I pray for strength. Even writing offered only a temporary balm. The memories returned with cruel persistence. Despite the anguish, I began to notice subtle changes within myself. The fear, though constant, became something I could manage. My hands moved more steadily, my mind processed emergencies with sharper focus, and I could act decisively even as dread churned beneath my ribs. I realized that grief and fear were not weaknesses, but signals, reminders of what we risked, of the bonds between crew members, and of the preciousness of survival. In the quiet moments, I would linger near the bulkhead, imagining conversations with those we had lost silently, vowing to honor them by living, by performing my duties with precision, and by protecting the remaining crew. Each decision, each maneuver became infused with meaning. Survival was no longer merely about staying alive. It was about living with purpose, about carrying the memory of those who could not continue the journey alongside me. The Atlantic was vast and indifferent, but within its cold expanse, I found the fragile spark of resilience, the determination to endure, to learn, and to grow, even amidst the relentless shadow of loss. After the last harrowing engagement, the respite was brief. Our commanding officer gathered the crew in the cramped control room, his face taut and expression unreadable. Orders were handed down. We were to embark on a new patrol, a longer and more dangerous mission. This time, our objective was to safeguard a critical convoy, ensuring that vital supplies reached German positions along the Atlantic coast. The weight of the responsibility settled heavily on me. Lives depended not only on skill, but on vigilance, coordination, and timing. The Atlantic had become familiar, yet each patrol presented unpredictable challenges. The enemy had adapted. Allied ships now patrolled in tighter formations, sonar and radar arrays had become more sophisticated, and aircraft prowled the skies relentlessly. I learned quickly that caution was not enough. Every decision mattered. A delayed turn could expose us to depth charges, a misjudged speed could give away our position, a single miscalculation could cost lives. The pressure was constant, suffocating at times, yet the discipline and training instilled a rhythm in our actions, a fragile order amid chaos. Days blended into nights. The submarine became our world, a vessel, both sanctuary and prison. The hum of engines, the subtle vibrations through the hull, and the flickering lights became markers of time, a rhythm we clung to as we moved silently beneath the waves. Supplies dwindled, air grew stale, and fatigue pressed heavily on every muscle. I could sense the tension in my crewmates, a mixture of fear, concentration, and determination. We relied on one another entirely. Our lives were bound together by trust and the shared knowledge that a single lapse could be fatal. During one particularly tense patrol, a patrol aircraft appeared on the horizon. The captain's voice rang through the compartment, urgent but controlled, silent, running dive to 60 meters ballast full. My hands moved automatically, following the protocols drilled into us countless times. The sonar's ping reverberated through the hull like a heartbeat, each pulse marking both danger and opportunity. My pulse raced, yet beneath the fear there was a sense of pride. Our actions had the power to protect the convoy and preserve the lives of countless civilians, at least in some small measure. Even amidst the relentless stress, moments of accomplishment punctuated the monotony. Successfully evading detection, maneuvering through treacherous waters, or aiding a wounded comrade instilled a sense of purpose. I realized that survival was intertwined with action, that courage and diligence could tip the scales in our favor. Yet alongside triumph remained an awareness of mortality and the ever-present specter of loss. By the end of that patrol, I had learned a hard truth. Endurance required more than physical strength or technical skill. It demanded patience, mental fortitude, and unwavering trust in my comrades. The Atlantic was vast, indifferent, and often merciless, but within that vastness we had carved out a fragile space for survival, for duty, and for the subtle pride that came from fulfilling our roles against impossible odds. Weeks at sea under constant threat began to shape me in ways I had not anticipated. The Atlantic's gray expanse, the relentless pressure of patrols, and the ever-present danger forced me to confront my fear, to make decisions that weighed heavily on my conscience. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to act in spite of it. Every maneuver, every choice to dive, evade, or engage required clarity and resolve. And over time, I learned to trust not only my training, but my instincts. One evening, a distress call crackled through the radio. A fellow submarine in a neighboring sector had been damaged and was drifting in enemy waters. Orders came swiftly. If possible, we were to provide aid. I hesitated, torn between following protocol and risking our own safety. The decision weighed on me. One wrong move could doom our crew. After a tense consultation with the captain, we executed a careful maneuver, navigating through enemy patrols to provide assistance. Watching the wounded sailor being secured on our deck, I felt a surge of pride tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. Survival, I realized, was a collective effort reliant on loyalty and sacrifice. Other moments were quieter but equally formative. I had to balance the needs of the mission against the welfare of my crewmates, choosing when to press forward and when to withdraw, when to take risks and when to hold back. Each decision was a test, a measure of character as much as skill. I discovered reserves of patience, restraint, and empathy I had not known I possessed. Leadership, even in small ways, became a responsibility I could not shirk. In these crucibles, the bonds among the crew deepened. We relied on one another not only for physical survival, but for mental endurance. A reassuring nod, a whispered instruction, or simply sharing the silence of a long, tense watch became acts of solidarity. I learned that loyalty was not abstract. It was practiced in every adjustment of a valve, every careful navigation beneath the waves, every small act that preserved life. By the end of these extended patrols, I understood that war demanded more than obedience. It demanded judgment, integrity, and courage in the face of uncertainty. I had grown not into an invincible sailor, but into a man capable of facing fear, making difficult choices, and carrying the weight of consequences. Every decision, every risk, every act of care or vigilance became part of the fabric of who I was forging. A resilience that would define not only my survival, but my understanding of duty, honor, and human connection beneath the relentless, indifferent Atlantic. Time at sea had changed my understanding of what it meant to be a soldier, a sailor, and a human being in the midst of conflict. The war was no longer a distant concept or a matter of obedience. It had become visceral, intimate, and morally complex. Each patrol, each engagement forced me to confront not only the strategic and technical demands of survival, but also the ethical and emotional consequences of our actions. I began to see the weight of responsibility in a new light. Orders were no longer abstract commands. They were choices that affected lives, sometimes in ways that could not be undone. The faces of fallen comrades haunted me, but so did the civilians caught in the crossfire, and I questioned the purpose of some of our missions. It became clear that courage alone could not absolve us of the moral implications of our actions. I needed judgment, discernment, and an understanding that each decision carried significance beyond immediate survival. Despite these doubts, moments of triumph reaffirmed my sense of purpose. Successfully evading enemy patrols, protecting a convoy, or saving a fellow sailor from harm brought fleeting pride and a sense of agency. I realized that while the ocean was vast and indifferent and the war relentless, my role within it was defined by choices, small, careful, deliberate acts that could mean life or death. The mission was larger than myself, yet within it I discovered a measure of control and meaning. This shift in perspective changed how I interacted with my crew. I listened more attentively, offered counsel when decisions were difficult, and observed the subtle needs of my fellow sailors. Leadership became less about authority and more about stewardship, responsibility, and empathy. Trust was not assumed, it was earned through consistent action, vigilance, and the shared acknowledgement of our mutual vulnerability. By the conclusion of this chapter of patrols, I understood that war had shaped me profoundly. I was no longer the wide-eyed young man who had first climbed aboard a U-boat in Hamburg. I had learned to balance fear with action, obedience with conscience, and survival with moral awareness. Each wave, each mission, and each choice had contributed to my growth, preparing me for the challenges that still lay ahead. I realized that the lessons of the Atlantic were not only about strategy or courage, they were about understanding the human cost of war, the value of camaraderie, and the enduring importance of personal responsibility in a world defined by chaos and uncertainty. The harbor of Hamburg came into view like a fragment of a world I had once known, yet it felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The ruins of buildings scarred by bombings lined the docks, chimneys still smoldering, smoke curling lazily into the gray sky. The air carried the acrid tang of fire and salt mingled with the subtle smell of machinery and oil from the port. I stepped off the gangway, my legs trembling not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of everything I had survived and everything I had lost. My parents were there, waiting amidst the rubble of our neighborhood, their faces etched with worry, hope, and the cautious disbelief of reunion. My mother rushed forward, tears spilling freely as she clutched me in a trembling embrace. "Erik," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you've come back to us." My father, ever stoic, rested a hand on my shoulder, eyes glistening with restrained emotion. I held them both, breathing in their presence, grounding myself in the reality that despite the horrors of war, some fragments of home remained. Walking through the streets, I was struck by the stark contrast between survival and devastation. Neighbors emerged cautiously, sharing nods and brief smiles, tentative acknowledgments that life continued even after the relentless pounding of bombs and the long months of fear. Every familiar corner of the city carried the memory of my childhood, now overlaid with the weight of wartime absence. I felt the odd mixture of relief and alienation. The city was home, yet I had changed irrevocably. Inside our small apartment, I lingered over every detail: the worn furniture, the bookshelves, the faint scent of my mother's cooking. I felt the ghosts of my crewmates with me, shadows of those who would never return, mingling with the living warmth of my family. The Atlantic, the submarine, the endless patrols they had altered me, leaving traces of fear, discipline, and resilience that would shape the man I had become. In that first evening home, I realized that returning was not merely a matter of geography, it was a reconciliation of past and present. I had survived, but I was not the same Erik who had boarded the U-boat all those months ago. I had witnessed the depths of human courage and fragility, and the city before me, scarred yet enduring, mirrored my own journey from boyhood dreams to the grim reality of war. Returning to Hamburg brought relief, but it did not erase the shadows that had settled deep within me. Nights were the hardest. I woke repeatedly drenched in sweat, haunted by flashes of explosions, the screams of fallen comrades, and the relentless pounding of depth charges. The corridors of the submarine, narrow and suffocating, had imprinted themselves on my mind, and in the quiet darkness of my room I could still hear the hum of the engines and the distant ping of sonar echoing in my ears. Physically, the toll of extended patrols lingered. My shoulder still ached from the shrapnel wound, and fatigue clung to me like a second skin. Simple tasks, walking through the city streets, carrying groceries, or climbing the stairs to our apartment, reminded me of the strength I had expended beneath the waves. Sleep remained shallow and fitful, punctuated by nightmares that blurred the line between past and present. The hardest challenge, however, was reintegration into daily life. Conversations with family and friends felt distant. Laughter sounded foreign, and ordinary routines seemed trivial compared to the constant vigilance I had maintained at sea. I found myself withdrawing at times, staring out over the harbor, tracing the waves with memories of patrols, evasions, and close calls. Even small disturbances, the sudden clatter of a crate or a passing siren, could trigger a jolt of adrenaline, a reminder that danger had once lurked everywhere, and that the Atlantic's lessons remained vivid. Yet amid this turbulence, I sought ways to process my experiences. I began writing, recounting patrols, battles, and losses in a journal I kept hidden beneath my bed. Each word was a lifeline, a method of grappling with grief, guilt, and lingering fear. Speaking with my family also helped, though. I often simplified the horrors their presence offered, grounding a tether to a world that continued despite the scars of war. I realized that survival was only part of the journey. The rest lay in learning to live with memory loss and trauma. Each day became a delicate balance, honoring the dead, preserving the living, and finding space within myself for peace, resilience, and the possibility of hope. The sea had changed me irrevocably, leaving both wounds and wisdom that would shape the remainder of my life. Sitting by the harbor, watching the waves ripple against the docks, I found myself reflecting on everything I had endured. The Atlantic had tested me, the war had shaped me, and the loss of comrades had marked me in ways I could not fully describe. I understood now that war was not merely a contest of tactics, or might it was a crucible of human endurance, a measure of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that tie people together. I thought of the friends who had not returned, of the young sailors whose laughter I would never hear again. Their memory demanded acknowledgement, not just sorrow. Every patrol, every maneuver, every decision had been a lesson in the fragility of life and the necessity of loyalty. I carried these lessons forward knowing that survival was not enough. We owed it to the fallen to live with purpose, to honor their sacrifice through our actions and our remembrance. The war had also shown me the complexity of human morality. I had seen the thin line between duty and conscience and the weight of choices made in the shadow of life and death situations. I realized that peace was not simply the absence of conflict, but a conscious commitment to remember, to understand, and to ensure that the costs of war are never forgotten. Now, standing on the shores of Hamburg, I understood that the Atlantic, the submarine, and the battles had left more than scars. They had left wisdom. Courage, resilience, and the bonds of camaraderie had carried us through the darkness. And as I gazed at the horizon, I felt a quiet resolve to live fully, to honor those who could not, and to carry forward the fragile, enduring hope that even in the aftermath of destruction, the human spirit can find meaning, peace, and redemption. As I stand at the edge of the harbor, the gray Atlantic stretching endlessly before me, I am struck by the paradox of survival. The sea that once threatened to consume us now lies calm, indifferent, yet full of memories, echoes of storms, battles, and the faces of those who never returned. I carry them with me not as burdens, but as enduring reminders of courage, sacrifice, and the fragile beauty of life. War has taught me that bravery is not measured in triumphs or victories, but in the quiet choices we make to protect one another, to endure hardship, and to honor those lost. The lessons of the ocean, the submarine, and the relentless campaigns of the Atlantic are etched into my being. I have returned to Hamburg, a changed man, shaped by fear, grief, and fleeting triumphs. Yet amid the scars, I have found purpose and a commitment to memory. Though the world may move on, the echoes of the firestorm remain a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the cost of duty, and the enduring hope that even after darkness, peace, understanding, and redemption can emerge. The journey ends here, but the memories, the lessons, and the courage persist, carried forward in every heartbeat, every decision, and every story shared with those who listen.